Good evening, FCBC family, and thank you for joining us on our empowering conversation series, Conversations That Act, Awaken the Conscious Today. Of course, you know me, Pastor Heaven, and I have the political guru himself, Pastor Mike, joining me this evening for our conversation series. And so today we are going to talk about a couple things, but most importantly, the election, because we know what, Pastor Mike, that the election is?
This is the most critical election of our lifetime, and it is 5 days away. And so we want to move forward with this. And so let's go, Pastor Evan.
Listen, so we're going to hit off with some hot topics. But before we get to our hot topics, Pastor Mike, what shirt are you wearing today?
I am wearing, family, my vote shirt, as you can see, and Pastor Heaven is wearing hers. Why? Because it is important that in this season, everyone comes out and vote. We have seen almost record numbers of turnout with regard to early voting, mail-in ballots, but we know that the actual election is on Tuesday, November the 3rd. And so it's critical that we all get out and vote. And not just ourselves, bring your family, bring your friends, get everyone out so they can understand that it is their responsibility to participate in this civic activity, especially in this season. And I've said so many times over the years that if you do not vote, in some ways, you forfeit the right to even complain. There are people who don't like that, but it's the truth. If you do not vote, if you do not do your part, you almost forfeit your right to complain in this season. And there's been much to complain about these past 4 years. That means that we have much to do in terms of turning out the vote. So it's critical this season.
Definitely. We have so much to do. And as Pastor Mike mentioned, there have been over 73 million individuals that have already casted their ballot. And so in New York City, we know that this past Saturday was the first time that you could early vote. So if you have not, make sure that you go out and you vote early so that you don't have to wait in the lines come Election Day. Pastor Mike, have you voted yet?
No.
Okay, but you plan to. I know you plan to.
Absolutely, I'm going to vote. I am going to make sure I vote. I was about to say I would vote twice, but then, the president said it's election fraud. So
yeah, we don't.
I'm going to vote once, one good time. But yes, I haven't voted yet, but I am going to vote very soon.
Awesome. And so, as many of you know, if you've watched last week we started with some hot topics. And so this week, Pastor Mike, we are going to start with hot topics, of course. So this week, Amy Barrett was actually confirmed as the Supreme Court justice. So what are some of your thoughts? What are some of your concerns around this confirmation hearing just days away from the election?
Yeah, I was doing a radio show on Tuesday, and someone called in and said, I feel like the Democrats did not do enough to prevent the not just the nomination, but the confirmation. And I had to let the person know the Democrats did what they could do, but they did not have power in the Senate. I've been saying this. I've said it every week we've done these series, and that is this. Your political decisions, your choices, your action or inaction has consequences. And we saw the consequences 4 years ago with people who did not want to vote, who voted third party. They said they didn't like Hillary Clinton. They didn't like the choices. Your choices, your actions have consequences. And the confirmation of Amy Barrett was another consequence. Right? Because the Senate was able to push that through because the Senate had the majority. How did the Senate get the majority? They were voted in the majority. How does that take place? By voting. And so it's critical. And so I think in many ways, it will shape the legal landscape of this country for a generation. And we have dealt with the past a 5-4 split. Now, with the death of Justice Ginsburg and now the confirmation of Justice Barrett, it is a 6-3 split along conservative lines. I've said it before and I will say it again. In this country, we have, with some challenge, survived a 5-4 split. Those of us who are on the progressive end, the more liberal end of policy and legislation, we will not be able to survive really a 6-3 split. And I think that's why this confirmation was so critical, and not critical because we could have stopped it, but critical so people begin to see what happens when we disengage, what happens when we forfeit our power, what happens when we don't take our civic responsibility seriously. And as we've seen this past week, we've seen how Mitch McConnell rushed it through. We saw the confirmation hearings take place with Lindsey Graham spearheading that. We saw it all unfold, and tragically, many of us felt powerless and helpless to do anything. The Democrats tried to stage a boycott by not being part of some of the confirmation. but it really had no impact. They couldn't stop the vote. They couldn't stop what was done. And I hope that it was a good lesson for many people who are watching this to understand how politics works, to understand how the confirmation hearings take place. But I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say it all night tonight. Yeah. To understand that your indecision, your inactivity, your apathy has consequences. And that's critical.
And I think if we want to elaborate a little bit more about these consequences, you and I were having this conversation about where you stake and put your power in. And the Republican Party has really staked and put their power into sort of the judiciary system. And so there was a conversation that Mitch McConnell had this week where he had clearly stated and knew that a lot of the successes that the Republican Party has made, whatever they would define as success, are going to be repealed over these next couple of years because they are aware and that they know that the tide is shifting and that the makeup of this country wants something different, wants a leader and wants leaders that represent our views and our values. And so Mitch McConnell knows it's going to happen. And we talked about this a lot, that there are so many different young judges, not just Amy Barrett. So I want you guys to hear this. Amy Barrett is not the only judge that Trump has appointed that will radically shift the makeup of this country. There are thousands, hundreds of judges that were nominated this year by Trump. Trump has completely changed the judiciary landscape at this point. Absolutely. And one person I had a chance to read this week, and sometimes we name these people, we say numbers, but we never put a face with a name. And The Atlantic this week put out an article about a judge named Justin Walker who was put into the Federal Appeals Court, which is one of the highest courts in the land. Mm-hmm. So he was put there at the age of 38, only having minimal experience, a year of experience, Pastor Mike, and put in this position. And now he can drastically change the makeup of this country, whatever decisions that come up to him. And he has been someone who has publicly supported Trump. Yeah. He's not hiding it.
No, I think, this has been my personal axe to grind over the past, I would say, several years, that the judiciary was at the forefront. It was always about the judiciary. And Mitch McConnell made that clear. I remember the night when Donald Trump accepted the party's nomination. Mm-hmm. Mitch McConnell made it very clear that his focus would be changing the judicial landscape of this country, putting forward new judges, changing the Supreme Court. That was their aim, because here's what we know. Whether President Trump wins or not, with regard to the judiciary, it doesn't matter. Right. These are lifetime appointments. So if Donald Trump loses the election, if Mitch McConnell is no longer the Senate Majority Leader, these decisions with regard to the judges on federal courts and the Supreme Court are lifetime appointments. The damage has already been done, and we have to figure out ways, nuanced ways, to reimagine what activism looks like when the highest court in the land is slanted so heavily towards the conservative side. Many of these judges you talked about that were pushed through confirmation in the Senate and are now part of the judiciary, many of these judges were, one, young and inexperienced. This new Supreme Court justice, she has never tried a case in her lifetime. Think about that.
That is ridiculous.
A Supreme Court justice who only had minimal years of experience in private practice has been a judge appointed by the president in 2017 in the federal judiciary, and now nominated Supreme Court, and has never tried a case.
Wow.
This is what we're dealing with. He has pushed through inexperienced judges who he likes, who he believes will favor the conservative slant of the country. And that's what we're dealing with now. This is what power looks like. The problem is we've just never seen a president use power in this way, so overtly slanted in one direction. Look, I'm old enough to remember Ronald Reagan. At least Ronald Reagan pretended that there was some empathy there. Yeah. This president doesn't even care to pretend. There is no empathy. He has one objective, and that is to slant everything in his direction based on the policies, not that he wants to enact, because I don't think he's smart enough to understand the full range of policy, but he's doing the work of those behind the scenes who are pushing for so much legislation.
And I want to add to that, something that you said was really powerful around getting a leader in office that you can have conversations with that are willing to move the pendulum. So you mentioned Reagan, right? You mentioned a Bush. These conservative leaders who at some point you could have conversations with them. You could push them. He's someone that we can't even sit at the table with. I mean, who would want to sit at the table with somebody who one spews out the things that he does, says the things that he does, one tells all the lies that he does? Why would you want to have a conversation with that man? And so when we think about this time is not just having a leader that's a Democrat or Republican, but a leader that's willing to listen to the people. Yeah. And that's important. And if you don't have a leader that's willing to listen to the voices of this country, the people of this country that are putting you in office, that's a scary thing.
Well, the thing about it is I do think on some level, and this is not even pushback to what you said, I think on some level that Trump is listening to certain voices. He's just not listening to all voices.
That's another
He's
thing.
listening to his base, the people who support him. And what we always have to remember, as bad as some people, now I'm a Democrat, you're a Democrat, as bad as some people may believe this president to be, almost half the country believes that he's doing a good job. Almost half the country will vote for him. Listen, in votes cast in early voting and the like, in Florida, 2.6 million votes have been cast already for Democrat. 2.3 million have been cast for Republican. You see, sometimes when we live in these bubbles, we think that, well, this early voting is going to benefit the Democrats. No, Trump supporters are early voting as well. They have done mail-in ballots as well. They have been just as vigilant and active as well. And almost half the country supports what he stands for. Maybe not even the policies that he's pushing, but they support what he stands for.
Yeah.
And what he stands for is really taking this country back to a dark place in the long ago that is damaging and I think promotes the level of dysfunction that is not just damaging to the country, but damaging to democracy.
Yeah. Well, not only was the Supreme Court justice one of the things that happened this week, but a couple of the things that happened that are not being talked about, of course, because the election cycle is taking up the news cycle. I think earlier this week, we had the Facebook, Twitter, and CEOs testify in front of the Senate, and they were testifying to keep a certain particular law that protects them, and it's actually called Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, and it's of 1996, and it protects them from any information that, let's say, you, myself, or a private citizen puts out that might be wrong, that could potentially harm somebody. It says that they have no liability. And so right now, they are currently having this conversation, and the Republicans and the Democrats actually both don't support this because they have seen in this particular election season and then the political season and then in this political environment how misinformation has drastically changed the makeup of this country, right? So I'm curious to know, for you as someone that, you're on social media and you've seen sort of the negative things about social media, what do you think the responsibility is of these tech companies regarding misinformation that's being put out on their websites?
Well, it's interesting that, as you said, the CEOs from Facebook, Twitter, Google were called to testify, and the Republicans made the call because the Republicans have felt and feel that these social media outlets have been unfair to the conservative side of the argument.
And I have to say that that's actually factually not true.
It's not true.
It's actually factually not true because there has been reports from different individuals that have shown statistically how actually these companies have been in favor and supporting information from the conservative agenda.
And misinformation. Yeah. And I think for me, it's interesting because one of the criticisms of Twitter, for example, and Facebook was that they were allowing it's one thing to put negative ads,
right,
but things that were blatantly and patently false and untrue that was skewing how people think. It was creating false narratives, and they were critiqued for that. That was one of my issues, that it's one thing to have an outlet to disseminate information. Social media has been that. Yeah. Good, bad, or indifferent, it has been that. But when you allow things that are patently false, lies, with the intent to do harm politically, socially, economically, culturally, and you allow that when there's no backlash for that, there's a problem. There should be instant fact-checking with regard to social media, especially Twitter and Facebook. The same way on the night of debates, they have someone who fact-checks what is said, because what happens is that there are people, let's take the last debate, for example. Donald Trump said a lot of things that were just not true. But there were people who didn't stay up past the debate to hear the fact-checking sessions. They're not reading fact-checking being printed in the media. They're not, so they believe what is being said, and based on who they like, they decide which truth they lend themselves to. So if you are a supporter of Donald Trump, the things he said, you lend your ears to that truth. If you're a supporter of Joe Biden, you lend your ears to that truth. So that means then there's really no potential for objective truth saying and truth speaking. It's based on how you feel about the person who's speaking. But that's what social media is. Unqualified people, because they have a platform and followers, can disseminate information that is taken as the truth by their followers and people who like them without actually doing the work to see if what is being said, one, makes sense, two, is even true, and three, is worthy of even lending our ears to, right?
And if anyone knows, the Instagram and the Facebook sort of algorithm puts it so that the information that you see is information that you are aligned with. So like the people that I follow, I always see stuff on my feed that's in support and has people share the same ideas as me. Rarely do I ever see anything that's representative of the conservative agenda. That's because the algorithm works that way. And so for individuals that are in support of Trump or who may not necessarily have, who may use social media, unfortunately, in this day and age as their news outlet, there are people, Pastor Mike, that will say to me, I say, where's your source? And they say social media, they say Facebook.
I said it on a call this week for the church that when I was young, coming up, and this would date me, there were commercials here in New York and in other parts of the country called RIF.
Okay.
Right? RIF stood for Reading is Fundamental. Right? there were commercials. I remember being a child, and RIF was a big commercial because the belief was, and still, that knowledge is power. And so the more knowledge you have, the more power you actually possess. So it's important to read, to understand. But right now, I think one of my biggest pet peeves is that people don't read anymore. Like you said, they go on to social media, they look at a story, they see a post, and they don't fact check. And so it's the truth. Now, I'm not saying that like the newspapers, everybody's perfect, but at least there's a modicum of standards being upheld that is not necessarily upheld in social media, right? And so I remember, I'll give you a classic example. When everything was happening in Louisville, Kentucky, with regard to Breonna Taylor and the Attorney General, right? There was on social media a lie that he was married to Mitch McConnell's granddaughter.
Wow.
That thing spread like wildfire across social media.
Wow.
People who I know, people who are smart people, sent this to me. And I immediately, what did I do? I went and checked. I researched. And I had to tell them, I said, this is not true. But there was a host of people for a few days who were saying, well, we know this is crooked. We knew that AG was up to something because he's married to Mitch McConnell's granddaughter. And it was not true. That's what I mean. There are people who can create narratives that are steeped in lies, and social media creates and it provides that platform to do that. So it is damaging. There are definite positives to it. We've seen that. Connectivity, getting information out. You have movements that are generated via social media. Activism is done via social media. Those are positives, but there are also some dangers in that, and we have to be mindful of. So I appreciate what the Senate is doing. The motivation for the Republicans who call this, though, is not necessarily valid. So.
Right. And, you know, Trump's going to use this as sort of his way of saying, like, look, I took down big corporate tech companies. You know, and it's in reality, it's like, did you? I don't know.
Well, listen, he has never seen a embellished story that he didn't like. So I'm not surprised at all with his use. I mean, you know, someone used the golf analogy when speaking about the president. He said, you know, he's a person who will turn bogeys, and if you play golf, you understand, who will make his bogeys birdies, which means his mistakes he will make as an asset. I mean, it's amazing, but it's tragic. So, but I'm glad that you raised this issue because, again, one of the reasons we want to have these conversations was to enlighten people with regard to issues that don't get covered often and are overlooked. You did an amazing job last week talking about the threat to the SNAP program, which many people were not aware of, right? And even this program, this issue right now with regard to the tech companies having to answer to their standards in how they disseminate information. Many people bypass these issues, and these are the issues that really are designed to inform us and really can empower us if we just pay attention. So let's keep rolling.
Right. So the next biggest thing that we want to talk about is the election. Now, listen, Joe Biden, if you are hearing me right now, if I get one more text message from somebody from your campaign telling me that I need to vote, I am going to respond. I am almost tempted to respond to Joe Biden's campaign. Have you been getting any of these text messages?
No, I'm not on their radar, but apparently you are. So
I don't know why I'm on their radar.
I'm glad that they're harassing you. I mean, listen, honestly, it does show a level of seriousness. One thing I realized from the campaign is that they have learned the missteps of 2016 and are trying to correct and rectify those missteps. They're not taking any state for granted. They're even covering states that historically Democrats don't win because they believe, as according to Vice President Biden, something is happening in the country where people's fatigue and weariness of this administration is taking root. And the one thing that has aided and abetted that transformation is COVID-19. This president has tried to make us believe that this is not a real issue. And how many people have to die before it becomes a real issue for the president and for his administration? This is the thing that will undo him. The economy and the current recession, borderline depression, is a result of the pandemic. So how is it that you don't take the pandemic seriously and yet you tout that you are over the greatest economy in the history of any president? That's a lie. That's not true. It's a good narrative if it works. But again, he knows he doesn't have to speak truth. His base will believe it, but it is a blatant lie. We are suffering. This country is suffering because of pandemic. And think about what the statement he said. I think even during the debate, only about 2% or so, 2.5% maybe, of people who contract COVID pass away. And for them, if you listen to what he said, that was okay. That was acceptable. Well, only 2% of those who can only. Try saying only to families that have lost loved ones. Try saying only to people who have had to not be able to be with their loved one when they were passing, transitioning. Try saying only to those people who are not able to complete the ritual of even burying, mourning for their loved one. So when you say only, it is a radical dismissiveness of a human life, and it dishonors the dignity of human lives in that moment. But that's the language. It is a language steeped, whether we know it or not, in rugged capitalism, survival of the fittest. It is all of that. And that is how they think. That is the mentality. It's not even about herd immunity. It is a disregard for people and for people's lives who for some of them don't count, don't matter anyway.
And if I'm thinking about what voters are thinking as they're going into the polls, I would have to believe that the pandemic is probably top of their list. Our health, we would hope that the pandemic is on top of their list. I actually had a chance to recently watch a segment on CNN, and they were interviewing individuals who had voted for Trump previously, asking them whether or not they were going to vote for this upcoming election. Funny enough, it was interesting enough to see some of their answers. Some of the people, of course, were still going to vote for Trump, and for them to say things like, he's doing a great job, I was just like, I was almost like, what world are we living in? But beyond that, there was something that a woman in New Jersey had said, and she had voted for Trump, and she said in this upcoming election, she was going to vote for Biden. And the reason was because of the pandemic. And she simply said, because he was unwilling to wear a mask. She and the women in her community had band together to make over thousands of masks. And she said the complete disregard of our president to choose to not wear a mask when we were suffering, when we were making masks just to support our frontline workers, that simple fact shifted her over to say that he's not someone I want to vote for. So beyond the pandemic, what are some other things that voters are thinking about as they're sitting there, getting ready to fill out their ballots? We talked about the economy. We've talked about we've talked about the Supreme Court nomination. We've talked about the pandemic. What are some other issues? I know we haven't had a chance to touch climate change, but that's an important conversation, as we know that the president has really rolled back our commitment into the Paris Agreement, and that has really shifted sort of what we need to do. Scientists, I think, believe, and they say it by 2050 is when we need to have eliminated all of our carbon emissions in order for our country and our world to make sure that we're still here, that our children are still here. So what are some other issues that we should be thinking about that voters are going to be thinking about as they walk into the polls?
I mean, everything you said is right on point with regard to the economy, the pandemic, climate change, all the clear issues that face and shape this presidential election. But I want to inject one more that may not be, it is not necessarily an issue. It is not policy. It has nothing to do with the courts.
Yeah.
In some ways, I want to believe that human decency is on the ballot.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
The idea that we could have a leader who takes human life seriously, a leader who takes the lives lost seriously. I mean, think about our previous president. Now, I know he's above and beyond this current president, but there's been not one moment in these past several months that we've been dealing with this pandemic, not one moment where we've heard a call from the leader of this country to rally this country around this pandemic, to look into the camera and speak to people who are dealing with grief and pain and loss. There has never been that moment where he's been able, from the White House, to speak as someone who represents all interests. When he speaks about it, he talks about blue states leadership and how so many died. But here's the thing. If you know how pathogens move and spread, you knew it was a matter of time before those states, those areas that were not touched. Remember, here in New York, March, April, May, June, it was rough. And there were people in parts of the country who were looking at New York and looking at news and saying, whew, I'm glad I don't live in New York. Whew, I'm glad I don't live in New Jersey. Well, now if you're in South Dakota, they're building field hospitals. If you're in Montana, they have surges and outbreaks. In the Midwest, it is blowing. In rural, there is not one part of this country that has not been touched by this pandemic. In rural America, in rural farm countries, they have outbreaks. In Alaska, there's outbreaks taking place. So now what was deemed as something, one, that was in certain parts of the country, two, was impacting people of color disproportionately, now it is everywhere. And still to this day, the president has not demonstrated the capacity to lead from above. He's been crippling the presidency from below. And that has been tragic. And that's why I say I think that one thing that may be in people's minds as they vote, as the woman you talked about, who said the fact that he couldn't even wear a mask. Where is your concern? Where is your care? Where is your decency? Because even if you don't believe it, at least try to convince me, try to fake me out, to make me believe that there's some part of you that actually cares. He doesn't have the capacity to do that. He has not demonstrated that, which means actually he doesn't care. What he cares about is his businesses. What he cares about is his own progress. What he cares about is his own bottom line. What he cares about is enriching and empowering his friends. We have never seen so many inept, unqualified people holding cabinet positions. You have lobbyists who are now holding cabinet positions, who are friends, who are benefiting from their position with regard to the industry and area that they're over. I mean, we've not seen this. This kind of blatant, overt, corrupt practices. And he's the one who always talks about corruption and is overseeing what may be, when history looks back, maybe one of the most corrupt 4 years of any presidency in the modern era.
I think there's something that you said that was really powerful around this idea of a president that's able to unite and not identify states as a Democrat state or a Republican state. You know, we know that at some point during the pandemic, he was almost unwilling to give funding to certain blue states that were not in support of him. He said that you have to talk nicely about me
and
ask. We are talking about a sitting president that is literally, I mean, I don't want to, this is not fancy language, but was being petty. Petty. Within the highest office in the land, and telling governors and telling Governor Cuomo that if he did not abide, if he did not speak a certain way, if he was saying negative things about our president, that he would take funding away from New York City when we were in the midst of people dying. I remember that, Pastor Mike, as you were mentioning those months. Those were a hard couple months. And, we are at a point right now where we're getting ready to go into what we know as the surge, the new surge. And it's going to be one of the coldest winters, and I say coldest, not in the sense of like freezing cold.
Well, it will be.
But it will be that too, because of global warming, you guys. But because of the fact that we know that the mental health of our country, the fact that we don't even have a president that's talking about that right now, the mental health of our people. What are we going to do to make sure that, our minds are right during this season?
Yeah, I remember us having conversations in our weekly executive team meetings, and I was sharing how the one pandemic that's not being talked about is the mental health crisis. Winter is hard for people anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Especially if you're alone. Add to that the anxiety connected to the pandemic. Add to that the real trauma that people have embodied who've survived COVID. Add to that the amount of losses that have been experienced. Because, every person, they say, has a minimum of a tentacle, 10 tentacles of connection in their network, right? In their immediate network.
Yeah.
So if you have 227,000 plus people have died, think about the people who have been impacted. Think about the people who have been impacted by the one death, let alone 227,000 deaths. That means there are people who are suffering in some deep and penetrating ways, that the mental health of our country is at stake in many ways. An article I read in a scientific journal said that they believe that the majority of Americans since this pandemic have experienced depressive moments. Maybe not clinical depression, but everyone has experienced depressive moments. Think about that. And no mention of that.
And some of the depressive moments that some of the people I've spoken to have been being lethargic, being tired, finding themselves overwhelmed. And so in continuing this idea around talking about mental health, one of the things that I hear a lot, we've talked about this, is election anxiety.
Yeah.
Okay. That has been a terminology that has been used on many news cycles. The Atlantic has even created a Spotify playlist to ease your election anxiety. So as we're going into, counting down these last final days and we find ourselves overwhelmed, Pastor Mike, what are you going to suggest that we do when we find ourselves anxious about this election cycle, or we find ourselves anxious about this upcoming decision, just the uncertainty of this country and this world right now?
Yeah, what I would say in any situation, the election, I know this is at front and center for so many right now. And there is anxiety about what these next 4 years would be like if Donald Trump was reelected. That is all real. But at the same time, there's a circle I learned a long time ago. I think this is Stephen Covey. There's a circle of influence and a circle of concern. There are some things that I'm concerned about that I might not be able to influence. And oftentimes, the things that I'm concerned about that I can't influence are the things that cause the rise in blood pressure, the heart disease. And then there's a circle of influence, the things that I can influence, I can make an impact on. Then those are the things that ought to galvanize my energies. In this season, I know sometimes we feel that, my one vote won't matter, but it does matter. Yeah. I think I said it last week in our session, because my vote plus your vote and your vote and your vote, that adds up and makes a big difference. And although we feel like this is a daunting task and at times overwhelmed, it is within our reach to change the political landscape of this country. The anxiety is real, but always remember this. Something I learned years ago, late great Howard Thurman used to say, that the contradictions of life are not final. No matter how bleak and abysmal things may seem, those dark moments don't get the final word. And we have to put our faith in this. I've said it before. This is not the first narcissistic, misogynistic, bigoted, prejudiced president.
Yeah.
We survived others. Woodrow Wilson did a screening of Birth of the Nation in the White House. One of the most racist pieces of propaganda in the history of this country.
Yeah.
We've seen worse, right? And we've survived worse, and we've come through. And God forbid Donald Trump is reelected. Guess what? We'll come through that as well and come through it stronger, because we'll be forced in many ways to face some things head on. Now, I pray that that is not the case. I pray
I was
that.
in my mind as you were talking. I was just like, I was like, no, that's not going to happen.
No, I
that's
pray
not going to
that's
happen.
not the case. But the anxiety is real. But do not fret. This is where reading comes in again. Look back at history. Look at the things that have undermined and assaulted this country's noblest ideals, and we've survived that.
Yeah.
The anxiety is real. The trepidation is real. And even the fear is real.
Yeah.
But you know what else is real?
What's real?
Our strength,
Come on
our
now.
courage,
Come on
our
now.
confidence, and our capacity to overcome whatever can come our way. So I think that this is going to be, next Tuesday is going to be powerful.
It's going to be powerful.
I know that 2016, my wife can attest that we were here that night, part of the election. We had a gathering, a watch party, and people left here shell-shocked and hurting. And I remember I got home. I did not sleep.
Yeah.
I stayed up until the next morning in disbelief in some ways, but at the same time realizing that that following Sunday I had to stand in this pulpit and say something to this congregation. And I had to remind us where we come from and who we are. And so no matter who wins on Tuesday, our strength will rise to the forefront, either to fight against the insanity or to support a reimagining of our country after this 4 years of brokenness.
Yeah. And I know you're going to do a special Friday Night Live around sort of where do we go from here after the election next week. But regardless, like you mentioned, who wins, there's still work to be done. And so I want to remind everyone of that. No matter who wins next week on Tuesday, there is still work to be done. There is still racism that must be, fixed. There is still the economy. There is still the climate change. There are so many issues that regardless if it's Trump, if it's Biden, we have to hold our leaders accountable. And so we should not get complacent. I want to say that again. We should not get complacent. If Biden wins, and when Biden wins, I'm going to say that again, when, because you got to speak things into existence. When Biden wins, we as a people cannot get complacent, because now we have a leader who we think is going to represent us. We have to push him. We as a community and as a body of believers and people who believe in justice have to push him and push him and push him to do the right thing. So no matter who wins next week, there is still, Pastor Mike, work to be done.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it any better myself. And in fact, as you said, even if Joe Biden wins, there may be more work that needs to be done because there'll be a greater temptation to become complacent and pull back. So I'm grateful. Listen, family, I'm grateful that you all continue to tune in to these empowering conversations that awaken the conscience today. And join us on election night.
On election night.
Myself and Pastor Heaven will be here again. And we may have some special guests on election night. We'll begin at 8:30. And I'm not going to give the end time because, it depends on how things are going. It could be some interesting conversation.
We might need to be in prayer.
Yes.
I might just turn into a prayer revival.
You're right. So next Tuesday at 8:30, we'll be here again for Empowering Conversations, the election night edition.
Yes.
And so we look forward to seeing you here. Again, thank you for tuning in, family. I'm Pastor Mike, and this is
Pastor Heaven.
Heavy B, we call her. Take care. God bless, and many blessings, family.